Hello and welcome to this GCSE History exam paper guide. In this video we'll be looking at the structure of paper 3, that's your Germany paper. We'll be following the exam layout and timings introduced in summer 2025. The video will give you an overview of how to tackle the paper, but alongside that do remember you can find other videos on our channel which go through the technique for the individual questions in a bit more detail. First up, here you can see an overview of how the paper will be laid out. Before you sit the exam, you should memorise how long to spend on each question. You should also do some timed practice of your own on the different questions. So our first question is a source inference question. The first thing that you should do is to find and underline the focus of the question. In this case, we're being asked to infer two things from the photo about the Hitler Youth. So that's the focus. Now what we need to do is make an inference. That means a conclusion of our own based on what we can see in the source. So we make an inference and then we support it by adding a specific detail or a quote from the source. Now, because we're dealing with a photo here, we can't quote, but we can point to a detail we can see in it. And then we repeat that one more time for our second inference. The key thing here is that when we make our inference, we have to make sure that it's relevant to the focus. We have to make sure that we don't just copy out what we can see or what we've read in the source. So I'm going to show you a good example and a bad example. Here's a good one. First of all, we could infer that the Hitler Youth prioritised discipline. Now it doesn't say that directly in the source, but we can support it with a little detail because we can see the boys are lined up in rows. That suggests that order and discipline was important to them. Now here's a bad example. I could make the inference that boys joined the Hitler Youth, but that's not really an inference because, well, we can see that in the source. There's a boy stood in the photo. So I've really just copied out what's already in the source itself. So my technique hasn't worked there. Next, we have an explain question. The technique here is exactly the same as the explain questions on paper 1 and 2. But the only difference is that here on paper 3, we're offered a choice of 2 different questions. We just pick the one that we want to answer. Now the first thing we should do is to read the question really carefully, and we need to find the focus. This means what we're being asked to explain and the time frame. So if we look at the first example here, the focus that we're being asked to explain is why support for the Weimar Republic increased. And the time frame is 1924 to 29, so the golden years of the Weimar Republic. Now the structure of our paragraph is going to be very straightforward. We're going to write 3 PEE style paragraphs. Each paragraph will focus on a different reason why support for the Republic increased. Now it would be a good idea to spend a moment thinking about what your 3 reasons are going to be and jotting them down. The examiner will give you 2 suggested ideas for things you can write about, but these are optional. You don't have to use them. If you want to get to the top level, you must also have a point of your own. Here are the 3 reasons that I'm going to write about. In my first paragraph, I'm going to explain that the Locarno Pact helped to improve Germany's international reputation, and that made it more popular with Germans. In my second paragraph, I'm going to explain that the Dawes Plan created a booming economy which improved living standards. and this increased support for the Weimar Republic. In my final paragraph, I'm going to explain that Hindenburg became president, and that attracted middle-class support to the Weimar Republic. In our big point, we'll name our reason, addressing the question directly, and then in our evidence and explanation, we will explain that reason using some specific detail of our own. Now we're going to try and write developed explanations, so that means we're going to need our explaining connectives, and you can see I've given some here to remind you. The best explanations have a chain of these explaining connectives, one after another, really developing an explanation in detail. My final tip here is that you don't need an intro or a conclusion in this kind of question, and there's really no need to give a balanced answer, for example, for and against, because you're not being asked to debate the pros and cons of something. You're just being asked to explain why something happened. So there's no need for a two-sided balanced answer. The next part of the paper, question 3, comes in 4 parts, A, B, C and D. You should do these in the order they are set, as this will lead you through the paper. The first part is a source evaluation question. Start by underlining the focus of the question. In this case, the inquiry we're working on is the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. Prepare both sources by underlining relevant content. If you have a picture source, you should circle key details, and then do the same for the provenance. Underline the key features like who made the source, when was it made, where was it made and why. Then write 1 paragraph about each source. Do not try to combine or compare the sources. You won't get any marks for that. You will never be given a source that is useless, so always start with the positives about the source. Try to follow this structure when you write. Start with the content. Take a quote from the source. Make an inference. Then support it with your own knowledge. Do this twice if you can. Use this little phrase to get your technique right. The source says, which suggests that this is accurate as we know. When you've done that, you can start to write about the provenance of the source. Try to explain a positive feature and then a limiting feature. Finish the paragraph with a judgment. How useful is the source overall? And summarise your main reason why. Now, before we move on to the next question, let's just remind ourselves of some of the things that we might think about when we're evaluating sources. Whatever source we're given to evaluate, we're going to think about the following. When looking at the content, we might ask ourselves, is the content relevant? In other words, does the information in the source match the inquiry we're following? If it does, you could explain how the source helps to answer the inquiry. We might also ask, is the content true or accurate? The best way to do this is to support or challenge the content with some of your own detailed knowledge. When it comes to the provenance, we might look at the nature, that means the type of source, the origin, who made it, when and where, and we might look at the purpose of the source, why it was made. With these things in mind, we could then ask ourselves, is the creator of the source an expert, providing us with expert testimony? We might think about who the source was aimed at. Was it aimed for a public audience? And does that perhaps affect what the creator has said? Or is it only designed for a private audience? Often personal accounts tend to be particularly honest reflections, because they're written just for one person rather than an audience. You could also consider whether or not the source is reliable, trustworthy or not. Perhaps the content has been censored or staged for a particular reason, but you need to explain why you think that. The other thing we could think about with provenance is typicality. Now this means, does the source show how things were everywhere at all times? Or perhaps the source only really shows, for example, how things were in one place or one factory rather than everywhere in Germany. That makes the source a bit less useful because we can't really generalise about how things were everywhere. Now, although you're not going to comment on all of these aspects, you're going to try and comment on some of them in your answer. When you're doing this, you might refer to how accurate, how relevant, how reliable, or how typical the sources are. And you can see I've given you some sentence starters which you could use in your work. The next question is a comparing interpretations question. We'll be given two interpretations on the paper. These will be two short written pieces. We need to compare them and say what the main difference is. Now the first thing that we need to do is to underline the focus. This is what we're being asked to compare them on. In this case, we have to compare how they differ about the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. In the first sentence of our answer, we name the main difference between them. What we're looking for is a big difference of opinion, not a tiny detail. You can see I've had a go at doing that already. In the second sentence, we are going to summarise interpretation 1. What's the big view in that? And then we're going to give a short supporting quote from it. Then we're going to turn to the second interpretation and we're going to do exactly the same. We're going to summarise it and then we're going to give a short supporting quote. So actually we're only going to write 3 sentences on this question. Don't forget, when you introduce and start to write about interpretation 2, you're comparing. So try to use a comparison phrase like whereas. Now my tip here is this. Sometimes the interpretations might not disagree directly, but they might focus on a different area. So in this case, one of the interpretations was more focused on the powerful politicians, while the other one was more focused on ordinary Germans. The next step is an explaining interpretations question. Now, we'll be using the same interpretations that we used for the previous question. But this time, we will be asked to explain a reason why they differ. First of all, we underline the focus. It will be exactly the same focus as the previous question, which was the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. Now remember, on this paper we have been given some sources. We already evaluated those sources in an earlier question, so we're going to use them again here. We prepare our answer by matching each interpretation to one of the sources. In this case, interpretation 1 is based on what is written in source C. So you can see I've linked those. Interpretation 2 is based on what is written in source B. So I've linked those as well. Now the first sentence of our answer is always going to be the same. We are going to say that the interpretations differ because they place weight on different evidence. You should memorise this sentence and you'll use it for this question every time. And then we're going to follow a process. In our second sentence, we are going to summarise the view in interpretation 1. We're then going to link that interpretation to one of the sources, and then we're going to give a quote from that source to support our link. And you can see that's what I've done here. And when we've done that, we're going to do exactly the same for the other interpretation. So we're going to summarise it, we're going to link it to the other source, and then we're going to quote from that source. And you can see I've had a go at doing that here. Learn this process and use it in your answer. Now remember, because we're comparing, again we're going to use the phrase whereas in our answer. And that brings us to the evaluating interpretations question. The first thing we do is underline the focus of the question. Now that's exactly the same as the previous two parts of question 3. So we're working again on the reasons why Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. And we're asked, how far do we agree with interpretation 2 about that? Notice, although we're evaluating interpretation 2, we need to write about both interpretations in our answer. We should prepare both interpretations thoroughly. This means we summarise the main view in just one bullet point alongside the interpretation. You can see I've done that there as a model for interpretation 2. Then we underline what evidence has the historian used to put forward his or her view. Now I'm looking in particular for any facts that the historian has used, any opinionated language where the historian has emphasised something. So, for example, if the historian has used the word disaster, well, that's a very strong opinionated piece of language, so I might pick up on that. I also keep in mind that I'm looking for particular things that the historian has written, which I know stuff about, because I can use my knowledge to support or challenge it. When I've annotated both interpretations, I'm going to make a decision about which interpretation I think is better. And I'm going to put a tick alongside the interpretation which I prefer. When making that decision, I'm going to consider these sorts of things. Which interpretation is more accurate? In other words, which is more correct? Which interpretation is more complete? Has one of the interpretations missed out something really important? And also, which interpretation has exaggerated? Has one of them overemphasised the importance of something? Now this step of choosing our preferred interpretation is really important because it means that before we even start to write, we're absolutely clear on which one is the best interpretation. When I come to write, I'm going to follow a structure that looks like this. My first section will be about interpretation 2. I'll probably write 2 paragraphs here. First, I'll take a short quote from the interpretation and explain what it means. I will try to do that at least 3 times. Then, I will use my own detailed knowledge to support the interpretation. This means I'm going to provide some of my own facts and detailed explanation to agree with the interpretation. Then I will explain a limitation of the interpretation. In other words, I will try to explain something that it is wrong about, something it has missed out, or something that it has overemphasised. When I reach the end of this section, I'm going to make a mini judgment about how far I agree with interpretation 2. My second section will follow exactly the same process, only this time I will write about the other interpretation, interpretation 1. When I've done that, I will finish my answer with a short conclusion. Here, I need to say what my overall decision is. How far do I agree with interpretation 2? I'll lay this out by making my decision, giving a counterpoint, that means a reason why other people might disagree with me, and then I'll give my winning points. So my conclusion is going to sound a bit like this. Overall, I think this, but other people might say that. However, I'm right because here are my winning points. Now don't forget, in this answer you do get marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar, and this also means using keywords too. So make sure that you include those keywords from your knowledge organisers. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and take a look at our other GCSE history videos.